Now because this is void, it doesn't return anything. It doesn't give any of its variables back to something else. But let's change that. Let's assume that we want to grab one of these numbers, return it somewhere, and then print out its contents. So what we could do is change void to the data type we want. In this case it's integer, so let's write int. And now first of all we get a method, we get an error saying not all code paths return a value. So we have to actually return something, so long as it's an integer. So we could write the return keyword. We could write 1, for example, that would work. That means return the number 1. But that's not very meaningful. Let's actually return a variable we've created. Result sounds like a good one because we've done a little calculation beforehand. So let's hit return result. Okay, and then we will save it. And let's get rid of this print here and just have this to focus on for the time being. Actually, put that there. So we have a method, it returns a number. We've specified what number it's going to return, but now we need to figure out where it returns to. And in a language like C#, it's going to compile everything, but then read off line by line until it's all done. So if we start with our start method, it's going to call this, which means it's going to break here. Then it's going to go in to our method one at a time. So it's going to go here, set this to 1, it's going to go here, set this to 2, and then it's going to get result and make it equal 1 plus 2. Skip this because it's just a blank line. Then it's going to return result. And when you return, you go back to the original line where the method was called. And then you go to the line underneath, which is here. So we've returned something, but actually we haven't figured out a way to give it to anything in particular. So what we need to do is have a piece of storage for it. So because we're returning an integer, we could create a integer for it. So let's say int our int, for example, and then just have it declared but not defined. And we're going to define it by this return result. And to do that, it's very similar to how you define and set values into variables. The only difference here is we're setting the method into the variable because the method returns a value. If this was void, it would all break, because it doesn't return anything. So you can't actually get anything out of this, so it's not going to work. So you can only do that if you're returning a value. Now that we've got a value in here, we can print it out. So let's say print our int, and save it, go back into Unity, let it recompile, clear all this, and we're going to hit play, and we can see that the value 3 has been printed. Pretty cool. Now why do you need to do this? Why can't I just, go to print and then print the result directly here? Why do I need to return it at all? And that's a question about scope. So you have this method, you have these open and close braces here. And that means open here, do all this stuff, and then close. And then that pretty much locks in all of these things here. So you can't access these outside of these braces because they're all locked, local to this method, which is why you get this here. Result doesn't exist anywhere, only in here. Okay, that's why you have to return stuff. And that could be useful, if a character is going to level up and you need to pass some stats like HP or something to some sort of formula somewhere else that calculates something, and then that returns how much HP you're going to get. So that's where that could be useful. Even though you've got this out here, you need to actually have some sort of formula to give it something, and that's where your method comes in, and then you return the result back, and then you just figure everything out from there. So the only way to get good at this sort of thing is by practicing how to write methods and the difference between return types and not being able to return anything. So I said a lot of things, but hopefully you're following along. What else is there to cover about methods? You can't return more than one thing. If you wanted to return one as well, you can't. You can only return one. But what if you wanted to have two things in here come back? What could you do? One thing you could do is create a reference to something else. So let's create an integer and say, you know, our second item. And this is going to be the thing, you know, its value of which we're going to get from here. And we're also going to get the result value. So we're going to get two things out of this method. How do we do this? Well, let's say we actually want to pass in some parameters into our method itself. So at the moment there's nothing here. But let's say, you know, take one thing as an input. And because these are integers, let's stick with that. So let's say this method is going to expect one integer as an input. So our input. And because it expects one, we need to actually pass in something here. So we could hard code a variable, you know, give it 100 or 90 or whatever you want, but that's not very useful. We want to actually solve the purpose here. So let's grab our integer that we made and pass it in. So that says, okay, call this method, pass in this variable or the value of this variable, duplicate it and set it into this integer here, and then use this at some point in your method. So, you know, the result could be 1 plus 2 plus the input, for example, and then return that value. So that could be useful. However, we're still not, you know, changing this to anything. We're just copying it over and then doing something. That's not very useful. And like I mentioned before, you can actually create a reference to this by writing ref here. And then similarly, you do the same here, ref int. And that means that's short for reference. So you're saying, get a reference to this, pass it into here. So rather than duplicating something, you're just having a placeholder of where the original one was. And now if you do all of this, so you store it into result, and then let's say our input is equal to the result as well. We're not only returning this value, but we're modifying this, which is a reference to this. So this value will change. So now we can print these things out and see what happens. So now we've got our int here. We can then get our second item here, and let's say, sorry, I need to add this like this. Let's say these are after method call, and to append stuff you have to use this plus. So we're not actually adding things here, we're just tagging things on the end. So we're printing multiple things, that's all that's doing. And then what we're going to do here is print the result. So we've got three things to look at. And that with the semicolon, save it. Let's go back into Unity, clear this, and hit play. So we've got some things here. We've got 3 and what looks like 33. And I can assure you it's not 33. It's just because our two integers are stuck right next to each other. So, you know, what we can do is just add a space here. Let's save it, go back here, clear this, and hit play again. So 3, 3, 3. Right. So we have 3 variables here. So we've got 1 plus 2 is 3. Print the result. set this into here, then return the value of result, which then gets set into here. So these two are linked up. And then this, which at the moment is just declared, doesn't have a single value, but we're passing a reference to where it is and then modifying it in here. So then when we modify it in here, it's going to have a direct result in the original position. So that's why when we print out its value, it has that value itself. If we got rid of ref, we're not referencing this one anymore. We are just creating a copy of this. So if we went to print it again, I'll show you. You just get rid of this. We can get rid of this. Save it and do this. Okay. Now if we were to print this out, it would no longer have a value of 3. So see, 3, 0. That's because we're not referencing it anymore. We're just merely passing it in, duplicating it, and then changing this variable's value rather than this one. So that's the difference between ref inputs and normal inputs. And they're useful for different things. You know, if you wanted to return multiple things, use the ref. It's very useful. You can have multiple inputs. You don't just need one. You could have 1,000 if you wanted to. Just be careful. Yeah. So we've got our methods here. We're calling our method. We're doing stuff. And we're returning values. And all of that encompasses the fundamentals of programming. You need to have methods in order to do things. You need the variables to actually store the data that you want to be able to do those things. And then you need the logic, the if statements and the loops, to execute your thought process. So if you wanted a character to move, when you press a button, you need the if statement logic, if a button is pressed, update the variables associated with the player, and then you can put that in its own method, player movement or something like that. So they all link to each other, and the best way to understand this, as I've said before, is to just do it really. You have to write lots of code, write it by hand, writing it out physically with anything, lecture notes, programming, your to-do list, your brain retains it much more effectively than if you were to type it, or if you were to just try and memorize something. So handwriting things, very important.